You knew early, not consciously perhaps, not in words, but somewhere in childhood you understood you were processing reality differently than the people around you. While other children seemed satisfied with simple answers, you asked the questions that made adults uncomfortable. While others played on the surface, you were already diving beneath it. You thought in layers, in systems, in patterns that revealed themselves only after long observation. You felt things deeply, not just emotions but meanings, implications, the weight of what wasn't being said, and you noticed with growing confusion and then quiet resignation that most people didn't. Carl Jung wrote extensively about people whose primary relationship is with the inner world, introverts who perceive through intuition rather than concrete facts. Whether their intuition works internally, seeing patterns in meanings, or externally, seeing connections between possibilities, the result is the same. They're wired for depth. These are who we call the deep intuitives. Part 1. The recognition. This is the defining characteristic of the deep intuitive, not intelligence, though that often comes with the territory. It's the inability to stay on the surface, the compulsion to understand not just what is happening, but why. Not just the event, but the pattern. Not just the word, but the intention beneath it. In modern personality frameworks, this often shows up as INFJ, INFP, INTJ, or INTP. But these are just approximations, trying to capture something that resists simple categorization, a mind wired for depth in a world designed for speed. Let me be clear, this is not another personality type content. The MBTI labels are entry points, not destinations. What Jung discovered, and what we're exploring here, runs deeper than four-letter codes. He didn't create types to put people in boxes. He identified patterns in how consciousness itself works. We're using the same lens here, examining the underlying architecture of minds that process reality at depths most people never access. The types help you recognize yourself, but the real work is understanding what it means to be wired for depth. The recognition often comes in painful moments. You're in a conversation that everyone else seems to be enjoying, but you're exhausted by its emptiness. You're at a party where the noise feels like violence against your nervous system. You're trying to explain something you see clearly, a pattern, a connection, a coming consequence, and watching eyes glaze over, or worse, narrow in suspicion. You learn early that your natural way of being is not welcome everywhere. That depth is often mistaken for pretension. That seeing patterns others miss makes you seem paranoid, not prescient. That feeling things intensely makes you too much for people who've learned to feel nothing at all. And so you learned to hide. You developed a surface self, lighter, easier, less demanding. You learned which insights to share and which to keep locked in the hidden chambers of your mind. You discovered that most people prefer the comfort of the shallow end, and they resent anyone who keeps diving deeper. But the hiding never quite worked, did it? Because depth isn't something you do, it's something you are. If you've ever felt like you're living in a world that speaks a different language, where everyone else seems content with surfaces while you're drowning in depths, you're not alone. You're not broken. You're not too sensitive. You're not overthinking. You might be a deep intuitive, and this world was not built for you. But that doesn't mean you can't survive it. It means you need a different strategy, a doctrine, a set of principles to navigate a reality that moves too fast, speaks too loud, and mistakes depth for dysfunction. Let me show you what centuries of psychological observation have revealed about minds like ours, what the world will never tell you about depth, and how to build a life that honors your wiring instead of fighting it. This is the doctrine for deep intuitives, the guide no one gave us, the permission we've been waiting for. Before we dive into what depth means and how to survive it, we need to establish something fundamental. You must see yourself clearly, not as the world sees you, not as you were taught to see yourself, but as you actually are. The world might call you an overthinker, a dreamer, too sensitive, too intense, too much in your head. These labels are the world's way of pathologizing what it doesn't understand. They're attempts to make you shrink your nature to fit a reality that moves too fast for depth to breathe. But here's what Jung discovered, what depth psychology has been trying to tell us for over a century. You're not defective. You're specialized. Your nervous system, your cognitive wiring, your entire way of being is adapted for a specific kind of perception that most people don't have access to. You see the invisible architecture beneath the visible world. You feel the currents that move beneath the surface. You recognize patterns that haven't yet manifested into obvious form. This isn't metaphor. This is neurology. This is psychology. This is the documented reality of how certain minds work. And the first principle of the doctrine is this: recognition without apology. You must see yourself clearly, not as the world sees you, not as you were taught to see yourself, but as you actually are, a mind built for depth, trying to survive in a shallow world. This recognition is not comfortable. It means accepting that you will always feel somewhat alien here. That small talk will always feel like sandpaper against your psyche, that you will never be satisfied with the answers that satisfy others, that you will spend your entire life translating between the depths you inhabit and the surface most people call reality. But recognition is the beginning of strategy. You cannot navigate effectively while pretending to be something you're not. The deep intuitive who tries to become shallow succeeds only in becoming miserable. So we begin here, with the truth of what you are, a mind that cannot help but dive. Part 2. The depth. Let's be precise about what depth means. It's not thinking more. It's thinking differently. It's not feeling more intensely than others, though often you do. It's perceiving layers of meaning that, to others, simply don't exist. When most people encounter information, they process it linearly. They move from A to B to C. They ask, "What is this? What does it mean? How do I respond?" The processing is direct, efficient, adequate for most situations. When you encounter the same information, something else happens. Your mind immediately begins constructing a web, not a line, but a network of connections. You don't just see what's in front of you, you see what it relates to, what it emerged from, what it might lead to. You see patterns, systems, implications that haven't yet become obvious. You're not moving forward through information, you're moving down into it, and simultaneously out into all the adjacent possibilities it touches. This is why conversations exhaust you. While others are tracking the surface content, the what of what's being said, you're simultaneously tracking the subtext, the body language, the tonal shifts, the inconsistencies between words and energy, the implications for the relationship, the patterns this moment fits into, the questions being avoided, and the meanings lurking in the silence. You're processing multiple levels at once, always. This is not optional. This is not something you chose to develop. This is your default mode of consciousness, and it's exhausting precisely because it's involuntary. The depth doesn't stop when you want it to. You cannot choose to see less. You cannot simplify your perception to match the world's pace. Telling a deep intuitive to not overthink is like telling someone to stop seeing in color. The architecture of your consciousness doesn't permit shallow processing. Jung understood this. He wrote about the introverted intuitive as someone who lives primarily in the realm of inner images and possibilities. For you, the external world is less real than the internal one. Not less important, less real. The world of meanings, patterns, and invisible structures feels more solid, more true, than the world of surfaces and facts. This is why you need solitude. Not because you dislike people, but because processing depth requires space. When you're constantly bombarded by external stimuli, you don't have the bandwidth to dive into the depths where your real thinking happens. Solitude isn't escape for you. It's where you do your actual work. And the work is constant. Your mind doesn't rest. Even when you're relaxed, even when you're supposedly not thinking about anything, you're still processing, still pattern matching, still weaving connections, still diving into the layers beneath whatever you're experiencing. People who don't live this way think depth is a choice. They think you could lighten up if you wanted to. They don't understand that your consciousness doesn't have an off switch for complexity. You don't choose to see systems. You can't unsee them. You don't choose to feel meanings. You're drowning in them. This is why the world feels overwhelming. Not because there's too much happening, but because you're experiencing too many layers of what's happening simultaneously. Consider a simple social gathering. For most people, it's straightforward. Show up, chat, enjoy the company, leave. For you, it's an orchestration of managing your own energy levels and their rapid depletion, the emotional atmosphere of the room and how it's shifting, individual conversations and their multiple layers of meaning, your social performance and whether it's convincing enough, the patterns of interaction and what they reveal about relationships, the things being left unsaid and why, your growing exhaustion and how to hide it, the correct moment to leave without causing offense, the recovery time you'll need afterward. You're not just attending a party. You're simultaneously participating in it, observing it, analyzing it, and managing your complex internal response to it. This is why 3 hours at a social event can require 3 days of recovery. You're not weak, you're operating multiple systems simultaneously. The depth isn't limited to social situations, it infects everything. You can't watch a movie without analyzing its structure, its themes, its psychological implications, what it reveals about the culture that produced it. You can't have a simple conversation without tracking its subtext. You can't make a decision without considering its ripple effects across multiple timeframes and contexts. This is the reality of depth. It transforms everything into an archaeological site. Every interaction, every experience, every piece of information becomes something to be excavated, layer by layer, until you reach bedrock. And here's what the world doesn't tell you. This is not dysfunction. This is a different form of intelligence. You're not overthinking. You're thinking accurately about complex systems that require complex thought. The world calls it overthinking because the world is addicted to simplicity. But reality itself is not simple. Reality is layered, interconnected, paradoxical, and constantly shifting. Your mind is adapted to perceive this accurately. Their minds are adapted to survive it by ignoring most of it. Neither is wrong, both are necessary, but yours is rarer. And rarity comes with a price. Part 3. The gift. Let me tell you what you can do that others cannot. You see the future before it arrives. Not through mysticism or supernatural insight, but through pattern recognition so sophisticated it appears prophetic. You observe the seeds of what's coming in the present moment. You track subtle shifts that others dismiss as noise. You recognize the early stages of patterns that won't become obvious for months or years. This is why you're often dismissed as pessimistic or negative. You're not predicting catastrophe. You're seeing the trajectory of current patterns. When you say this relationship won't last, you're not being judgmental. You're reading the invisible architecture of incompatibility that others haven't yet noticed. When you say this plan will fail, you're tracking the systemic weaknesses that haven't yet manifested into obvious problems. The world doesn't want to hear it. People prefer optimism to accuracy. But you're not wrong. You're early. And being early looks the same as being wrong, until time proves you right. This pattern recognition is your greatest gift. It operates across domains, relationships, systems, organizations, ideas, cultural trends. You see how things connect. You recognize when something that appears new is actually a repetition of an old pattern. You detect inconsistencies between what people say and who they are. You feel when something is misaligned long before it breaks. This makes you valuable in ways the world rarely acknowledges. You're the person who sees the problem before it becomes a crisis. The one who recognizes the dangerous person before they reveal themselves. The one who understands why things are going wrong when everyone else is still confused. But your gifts extend beyond prediction. You create meaning where others see chaos. When something painful happens, when life breaks apart, when systems collapse, most people are left disoriented. They don't know what it means. They can't find the pattern. They're lost in the rubble. You're not. You're already diving into it, finding the hidden structure, extracting the meaning, building the map. This is why people often come to you in crisis. Not because you have answers, but because you have the rare capacity to help them make sense of what's senseless. You translate depths into language. This is harder than it sounds. The depths you perceive exist beneath language, in the realm of felt sense and intuitive knowing. Most people can't access this realm at all, and those who can usually can't articulate what they find there. But you can. You can take the formless and give it form, the unspeakable and speak it, the invisible and make it visible. This is why you're drawn to writing, to art, to any medium that allows you to build bridges between the deep and the surface. You're not creating for creation's sake. You're translating. You're making the invisible visible for people who can't see it themselves. Your empathy is not surface-level sentiment. It's structural understanding. You don't just feel what others feel. You understand why they feel it. You see the hidden wounds, the unconscious patterns, the childhood origins of adult behaviors. You recognize the defenses people use without knowing they're using them. You feel the pain beneath the anger, the fear beneath the arrogance, the loneliness beneath the noise. This makes you dangerous to people who are lying to themselves. They can sense you see through them. They can feel your perception penetrating their carefully constructed facades. This is why some people are drawn to you with an intensity that feels almost desperate, while others avoid you or become hostile for reasons they can't quite articulate. You see too much, and people are afraid of being seen. But for those who are ready to be seen, for those who are tired of pretending, tired of surfaces, tired of performing. You're a revelation. You're the first person who's ever really looked at them. The first person who understood not just what they say, but what they mean. Not just what they show, but what they hide. This is the gift of depth, accurate perception of complexity. You're not making things more complicated than they are. You're seeing how complicated they actually are. The world needs this, desperately, because the world's addiction to simplicity is killing it. We collapse complex problems into simple solutions. We reduce human beings to labels. We try to understand systems by looking at isolated parts instead of interconnected wholes. We make decisions based on surfaces while ignoring the depths that will determine the actual outcomes. And then we're surprised when things fall apart. You're not surprised. You saw it coming, because you can't not see it coming. Your mind doesn't permit the comfortable blindness that allows others to remain optimistic in the face of obvious trajectories. This is exhausting, but it's also sacred work. Someone has to see clearly. Someone has to track the patterns. Someone has to feel the depths and translate them into language. Someone has to maintain the relationship with complexity while everyone else is frantically simplifying. That someone is you. Not because you're special in the hierarchical sense, not because you're better than others, but because this is your wiring, your gift, your strange and difficult inheritance. The question is not whether you have it. The question is what you'll do with it. Part 4. The curse. Now let's speak honestly about the cost. The depth that allows you to see clearly also condemns you to perpetual loneliness, because seeing what others don't means living in a different reality, and living in a different reality means being fundamentally alone, even when surrounded by people. You're lonely at parties, lonely in conversations, lonely in relationships where the other person loves the surface version of you, but has never met the depths. Lonely in a culture that celebrates speed over substance, distraction over depth, performance over authenticity. The loneliness isn't just emotional, it's existential. It's the loneliness of being the only one who speaks your native language, of constantly translating yourself into simpler terms just to be understood, of dumbing down your perceptions so others don't feel threatened, of hiding the depths because revealing them makes people uncomfortable. You learn early to practice concealment, not out of dishonesty but out of survival, because when you speak your truth, when you share what you actually see, feel, and think, people respond with confusion, dismissal, or hostility. They say you're overthinking, being negative, too intense, too serious, too deep. They tell you to lighten up, to be more positive, to stop analyzing everything, as if depth were a choice, as if you could simply decide to see less. Their inability to meet you at depth feels like rejection, because it is rejection. Not of you personally, perhaps, but of your actual way of being. They want the edited version, the surface self that's easier, lighter, less demanding, and so you learn to perform it. You learn to hide. But hiding your nature doesn't make it disappear. It just makes you disappear. You become a ghost in your own life, watching yourself perform a version of you that's acceptable to others, while your real self remains locked in chambers they'll never enter. This is the curse of depth in a shallow world, perpetual self-exile. And it gets worse, because your sensitivity, the very thing that allows you to perceive depth, also makes you vulnerable to it. You don't just see people's pain, you feel it. You don't just understand systems, you're affected by them. You don't just recognize patterns, you're wounded by them. The world is loud, harsh, violent in ways most people don't register. They've built defenses, numbed themselves, learned not to feel too much. You haven't. You can't. Your nervous system is raw, open, responsive to frequencies others don't hear. This makes daily life an act of survival. The fluorescent lights that others ignore feel like an assault to you. The background noise that others tune out overwhelms your system. The emotional chaos that others shrug off infiltrates your consciousness and takes days to clear. You need recovery time after social events, after conflicts, after exposure to environments that aren't designed for sensitive systems. People who don't live this way think you're weak or antisocial. They don't understand that you're not avoiding life. You're protecting your capacity to function within it. And then there's the weight of seeing. When you recognize patterns others miss, you carry knowledge that becomes burden. You see relationships failing before they fail. You see people self-destructing before they hit bottom. You see systems breaking before they collapse. And you're powerless to prevent most of it because people don't listen to warnings about futures they can't yet see. So you watch, you see it coming, you try to warn them, They dismiss you. And then it happens exactly as you knew it would. And everyone acts surprised. And you're left with the exhausting knowledge that this cycle will repeat, because people prefer comfortable blindness to uncomfortable foresight. This is the curse of Cassandra, seeing truly and never being believed. You become tired. Not physically tired, though that too. Soul tired. Tired of translating. Tired of hiding. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of living at a depth that isolates you from easy connection. Tired of feeling too much in a world that celebrates feeling nothing. And the world doesn't help. The world tells you to adjust, to be more like others, to develop thicker skin, to stop being so sensitive. As if sensitivity were a flaw to be corrected rather than a capacity to be honored. They pathologize your nature. They call it anxiety when you're feeling the actual emotional atmosphere of a room. They call it depression when you're responding appropriately to a depressing reality. They call it overthinking when you're thinking accurately about complex situations. They want to medicate away your depth, to therapy away your sensitivity, to coach away your intensity, all in service of making you normal, which is to say, shallow enough to fit into a world that has no room for depth. And some of you try. You try to become lighter, more casual, less serious. You try to care less, feel less, see less. You try to turn down the volume on your own consciousness. It doesn't work. You can suppress your nature temporarily, but you can't eliminate it. And the suppression itself becomes another form of suffering, a betrayal of self that hollows you out from the inside. This is the deepest curse. Not the loneliness, not the overwhelm, but the temptation to amputate your own depths in order to fit into a shallow world. Some of you have already tried. You've spent years trying to become someone else, someone easier, someone who doesn't feel so much or see so much or need so much depth, and you've discovered what Jung knew. You cannot betray your own nature without destroying yourself. The curse isn't your depth. The curse is living in a world that has no place for it. Part 5. The mission. So here's your situation. You're wired for depth in a world built for speed. You see patterns others miss. You feel things others numb. You need meaning in a culture of distraction. And you're exhausted from trying to translate yourself into a language that doesn't have words for what you are. What do? First, you stop apologizing. You stop treating your nature as a problem to be solved. You stop trying to become shallow enough to fit into a shallow world. This doesn't mean becoming arrogant or dismissive of others. It means recognizing that your way of being is not defective. That depth is not dysfunction. That seeing clearly is not the same as seeing wrongly. The world will continue telling you to change. Ignore it. The world's advice is designed for different minds. Minds that thrive on surfaces, that recharge through external stimulation, that find meaning in consensus and belonging. That advice doesn't apply to you. Following it will only make you miserable. Second, you accept the cost. You accept that you will be lonely sometimes, that you will be misunderstood often, that you will see things others don't want to see and carry knowledge others don't want to carry. You accept that there is no version of your life where depth comes without price. But you also recognize that the alternative, suppressing your nature, betraying your depths, becoming a ghost in your own life, costs more. You cannot become shallow without losing yourself. So you stay deep, not because it's easy, but because it's true. Third, you build chambers. This is literal and metaphorical. Literally, you create physical spaces where your depth can breathe. Spaces designed for slowness, for silence, for the kind of thinking that requires hours, not minutes, for the kind of feeling that can't be rushed. These might be rooms in your home, coffee shops at quiet hours, libraries, nature, anywhere the world slows down enough for you to be yourself without performance. These chambers are sacred. They're not optional. They're survival infrastructure. Without them, you'll burn out trying to exist entirely on the surface. Metaphorically, you find or create communities where depth is welcomed. This is harder than it sounds. Most communities, even those claiming to value depth, actually reward performance and consensus. You need spaces where real questions can be asked, where complexity isn't simplified, where your natural way of being doesn't need translation. These might be online. They might be small groups of 2 or 3 people. They might be mentors or therapists or writers whose work speaks your language. They might be historical figures whose books feel like conversations with someone who finally understands. You are not required to find your people in the flesh. Sometimes the deepest connections happen across time and space, through writing, through art, through the hidden chambers of human consciousness that depth workers have been building for millennia. Fourth, you become a translator. This is your role. Your mission. The reason depth is worth the cost. The world doesn't understand depth, but it needs it. Desperately. The world is drowning in surfaces, in quick fixes, simple answers, shallow solutions to complex problems. And it's not working. The world is falling apart in ways that anyone paying attention can see. But most people aren't paying attention. They can't. They don't have the wiring. They need translators. People who can dive into the depths, understand what they find there, and bring it back in language the surface can understand. This is what Jung did, what the great depth psychologists have always done, what artists and writers and mystics have done throughout history. They dove, they saw, they translated. You're called to do the same, not because you're special, but because you're equipped. Your nervous system, your consciousness, your entire way of being is adapted for this work. You can see what others can't, feel what others don't, understand what others won't. And then you must speak it, write it, create it, share it. Not for applause or recognition or validation, but because this is the work that justifies the burden of depth. If you don't translate what you see, who will? If you don't speak the depths, who will give them voice? If you don't build the bridges between deep and shallow, how will the world access the wisdom it needs to survive? This doesn't mean you must become public. It doesn't mean you must build a platform or gather followers or become any kind of voice that feels inauthentic to you. Translation takes many forms. Sometimes it's writing. Sometimes it's one-on-one conversations. Sometimes it's the quiet work of seeing clearly and acting from that clarity, creating ripples others never trace back to you. But you must not hide entirely. You must not let the world's hostility to depth silence you completely, because your silence is not neutrality, it's abandonment. It's leaving the world without what only you can give it. Fifth, you practice discernment. You learn when to speak depth and when to stay hidden, when to dive and when to stay on the surface, when to translate and when to protect your energy by remaining silent. This is not compromise. This is strategy. You cannot operate at depth in all contexts. Some environments are hostile to it. Some people are threatened by it. Some moments don't require it. You learn to recognize these situations. You learn to protect yourself, not by becoming shallow, but by choosing your depths carefully. You don't waste your gift on people who won't receive it. You don't exhaust yourself trying to translate in environments designed to keep things superficial. This is hard because you want to be authentic everywhere. You want depth to be welcome everywhere. But it's not. And spending your energy trying to make it welcome where it will never be accepted is not noble. It's self-destruction. So you become strategic. You find the people, the places, the contexts where depth can land, and you save your depths for them. This is not weakness. This is wisdom. Sixth, you make it sustainable. You create rhythms that honor your nature. You don't try to keep up with the world's pace. You move at the speed of depth, which is slower. You say no to most things so you can say yes to the few things that matter. You protect your energy with the fierceness of someone who understands that without that energy, you have nothing to give. This means disappointing people. It means being seen as unavailable. It means missing events, declining invitations, saying no to opportunities that would drain you. And it means accepting that people who don't understand depth will judge you for this. Let them. Your mission is not to be understood by everyone. Your mission is to do the work that your nature equipped you to do, and that work requires energy you cannot afford to waste on performances and pretenses. You build routines that support depth. You wake early or stay up late, whatever allows you time alone with your thoughts. You walk or sit in silence or stare at walls because depth requires space to emerge. You read slowly, think slowly, write slowly. You honor the pace that actual thinking requires, even when the world is rushing past you. And you forgive yourself for needing this, for being unable to keep up, for requiring what others don't require. Your nature is not a flaw, it's a specification, and specifications are not negotiable. Seventh, you find the others. We're out here, scattered, hidden in our chambers, writing at dawn, walking alone at dusk, sitting in libraries and coffee shops, seemingly idle but actually deep in the work of thinking thoughts too complex to speak aloud. We recognize each other, though not always immediately. There's a moment in conversation when something shifts, when the surface drops away, and suddenly you're speaking your native language with someone who understands it. These moments are rare. When you find them, honor them. These connections sustain you. They remind you that you're not alone in your loneliness. That depth, though rare, is not singular. That others are doing this work too, in their own hidden chambers, diving and translating and building bridges between worlds. You don't need many of these connections. 2 or 3 real ones are worth more than 1,000 surface friendships. Find them. Keep them. Let them remind you why the work matters. 8th, you remember this is not about you. The depth you carry, the patterns you see, the translations you make, these are not personal possessions. They're not achievements that make you better than others. They're functions, roles, work that needs doing. Some people are built for speed, for action, for moving through the world efficiently and confidently. The world needs them. You're built for depth, for seeing, for understanding complexity and translating it into wisdom. The world needs you too. Neither is superior. Both are necessary. And understanding this keeps you humble, keeps you focused, keeps you from the trap of using depth as a weapon of superiority. You're not better for seeing more. You're just seeing differently. And that difference is your contribution, your service, your strange and difficult gift to a world that doesn't always know it needs you. This is the mission. Stay deep, speak true, translate faithfully, build chambers, find your people, honor your nature, do the work, not because it will make you happy, though it might, not because it will make you successful, though it might, but because this is what you are, and betraying what you are is the only real failure available to you. Part 6. The practice. Theory is useless without practice. Philosophy means nothing if it doesn't change how you live. So let's make this concrete. Here's how to live as a deep intuitive without destroying yourself. Stop justifying your nature. You will be criticized for being too sensitive, too serious, too intense, too much in your head. Stop defending yourself. Stop explaining. Stop apologizing for being wired for depth in a shallow world. When someone says you overthink, don't argue that you don't. You do. You think deeply and thoroughly and complexly because that's how your mind works. That's not a flaw. That's a feature. Their inability to think at depth is not your problem to solve by thinking less. Accept that you'll be misunderstood. Most people will never fully understand you. They'll grasp fragments, surface versions, simplified translations of who you are. And that's okay. You don't need to be fully understood by everyone. You need to be fully yourself with a few people and partially understood by the rest. The alternative, trying to make everyone understand you, is exhausting and impossible. Let it go. Be mysterious. Be misunderstood. Save your full truth for those who can hold it. Remember you're doing sacred work. When you dive into complexity and return with clarity, when you feel the depths and translate them into language, when you see patterns and name them, when you hold space for the questions others are afraid to ask, you're doing the work that keeps the world from becoming entirely shallow. This work is not celebrated, it's barely noticed, but it matters. Cultures that lose their depth workers, their philosophers, their artists, their mystics, their seers become hollow. They lose the capacity to understand themselves. They make the same mistakes repeatedly because no one is paying attention to patterns. You are paying attention, and that attention, however exhausting, however lonely, however unrecognized, is service. Not because you're special, because you're necessary. Learn to say no without explanation. You will be invited to things that will drain you, events that serve no purpose for your depth, obligations that exist only because refusing them is socially awkward. Say no. You don't owe anyone an explanation for protecting your energy. The people who understand depth will understand your refusal. The people who don't understand depth wouldn't understand your explanation anyway. Save your words for those who can hear them. Recognize your limits and honor them. You can only handle so much social interaction, so much noise, so much chaos, so much exposure to people's pain. When you reach your limit, remove yourself. Don't push through. Don't try to be tougher than you are. Your sensitivity is not weakness. It's your instrument. You protect instruments. You don't force them beyond their capacity and then wonder why they break. Limit your exposure to noise. You cannot survive constant stimulation. You cannot maintain depth while drowning in the world's noise. The news, the social media, the constant connectivity, the manufactured urgency of a culture designed to keep everyone on the surface. You need silence, space, emptiness for your thoughts to emerge from. Create it by removing the noise. Be ruthless about this. Your depth requires protection, and the world will destroy it if you let it. Stop trying to keep up. You cannot move at the world's pace. You will always be slower because depth takes time. Let go of the fantasy that you can somehow speed up your processing. You can't. You can only betray it by skimming surfaces, and that betrayal will hollow you out. Be slow. Be thorough. Be deep. Let others rush past you. They're not going anywhere that matters anyway. Protect your mornings. If you can, wake before the world demands your attention. The early hours, when your mind is quiet and uncluttered, are when your deepest thinking happens. Don't waste them on email or news or other people's urgency. Use them for the work only you can do, the diving, the thinking, the creating. If you're not a morning person, protect your evenings or your nights. Whatever hours your mind works best, guard them jealously. This is your sacred time. The time when you're most yourself, most capable, most able to access the depths. Protect it like your life depends on it, because in a very real sense, it does. Create non-negotiable solitude. This doesn't mean becoming a hermit. It means building regular time into your life when you're completely alone, with no obligation to perform or translate or manage anyone else's needs, daily if possible. If not daily, at least weekly. Use this time however your depth requires. Some days you'll write. Some days you'll read. Some days you'll walk. Some days you'll sit and think and feel and let your mind wander through its natural patterns without rushing it toward conclusions. This solitude is not selfishness. It's maintenance. You cannot function without it any more than you can function without sleep. Treat it with the same seriousness. Build weekly rhythms. You need predictable patterns that support depth. For many of you, this might look like Sunday mornings for deep reading, Wednesday evenings for solitary walking, Friday afternoons for writing, Saturday nights for the one or two people you can be fully yourself with. Whatever the specific pattern, build it. Make it consistent. Let it become the skeleton your life hangs on, so you're not constantly making decisions about when to dive and when to surface. The decision is already made. The time is protected. Find your medium. You need a way to translate the depths into form. For some of you, it's writing. For others, art, music, building things, teaching, therapy. Find the medium that allows you to take what you perceive in the formless depths and give it structure that others can encounter. This isn't optional. If you don't translate, the depths accumulate inside you with nowhere to go. You become a dam holding back an ocean, and eventually the pressure becomes unbearable. Find the outlet. Use it regularly. Practice the hidden life. You don't need to broadcast your depths. You don't need to perform them on social media or explain them to everyone you meet. Much of your real life, the depths, the diving, the work, can remain hidden. This isn't deception, it's protection. The pearls you create in your depths are not for everyone. Some things are too sacred to share publicly. Keep them in the chamber. Let the world see only what it can hold. Read the ones who spoke your language: Jung, Rilke, Dostoevsky, Kafka, Woolf, Camus, Kierkegaard, the depth psychologists and philosophers and novelists who wrestled with complexity and refused to simplify it. They're your lineage, your tradition, your proof that others have done this work before you and survived it. You don't need to agree with them. You need to feel less alone with them, to see that minds like yours have always existed, have always struggled, have always translated. Find the Sunday rhythm. There's something sacred about the weekly cadence. Not daily, that's too fast, too demanding. Not monthly, that's too slow, too easy to abandon. Weekly, every Sunday, every seventh day, a rhythm as old as creation. Use it. One piece of depth work every week. One translation from the hidden to the visible. One offering from your depths to the world, not for applause, not for validation, but because this is the practice that keeps you sane. This is the practice, small daily acts of honoring depth, weekly rhythms of diving and translating, monthly patterns of solitude and reflection, annual cycles of going deep and coming back up with what you found. You don't have to do this perfectly. You don't have to do it publicly. You don't have to explain it to anyone. You just have to do it, because this is what you are, and the world, whether it knows it or not, is waiting for what only you can bring back from the depths. The chamber remains open. This essay will end, but the work doesn't. You'll close this window, return to your life, and the world will still be shallow. People will still not understand. You'll still feel the loneliness of depth. The work will still be hard. But something has shifted, hasn't it? You have a name now for what you are. A doctrine. A set of principles that honor your nature instead of pathologizing it. You know you're not broken. You know you're not alone. You know this is work, not weakness. The hidden chamber is not a metaphor. It's the space you must build, literally and psychologically, where your depth can breathe, where you don't have to translate, where you can be fully yourself without apology or performance. This essay is one chamber, the space you return to when you need reminding that depth is not dysfunction. that seeing clearly is not the same as seeing wrongly, that your nature is not a problem to solve. But you must build your own chambers too, your own practices, your own rhythms, your own weekly returns to the depths, because no one can do this for you. No one can honor your nature except you. The world will continue demanding that you become shallow, faster, lighter, less intense, more normal. Refuse, not arrogantly, not defensively, but firmly, absolutely, without apology. You're a deep intuitive. You dive, you see, you translate. You cannot stop doing this without ceasing to be yourself. And the world, however much it resists depth, however much it celebrates surfaces, needs you to stay deep, because someone has to see clearly, someone has to feel truly, someone has to think complexly, someone has to maintain the relationship with the depths while everyone else is drowning in the shallow end. That someone is you, not because you're better, because you're wired differently. And that wiring is not a curse to be cured, but a capacity to be cultivated. So cultivate it, build your chambers, find your rhythms, do your translations, speak your truths, honor your depths, stay deep when the world tells you to surface, because the deep mind cannot stay on the surface. And now it doesn't have to. The chamber is open, not with noise or fanfare or demand, but with an invitation. Return, dive, think, feel, be yourself without apology, and know that somewhere others are doing the same work, in their own chambers, at their own depths, speaking their own truths. We're out here, hidden but present, diving and translating, holding the depths while the world rushes past on surfaces that were never built to hold what we carry. This is the work. This is the doctrine. This is the way. Stay deep. The world needs what only we can see.